So our topic is spies and codes of the Civil War. So spies pass on information about regarding the enemies in the war, and it was sometimes crucial to win battles. As an example, in the Battle of Manassas, it was the battle plans of the Union were found out, and it was given to the Southern officers, and which helped them win the battle. Neither the North or the South had an intelligence agency at the beginning of the war, but the South started an embryonic spy ring in Washington, which is a bunch of Confederate spies working together around Washington, D.C., the capital, to help get information to the officers to help them try and win. It was started in the 1860s by Thomas Jordan. Yep.
Okay. So many of the spies were female. Female spies gathered information on troop sizes and figured out like the enemy's plans. And female spies didn't get caught very much because they weren't paid much attention to, because mainly it was like the men in the war and fighting. And some inventions that helped the spies were the telegraphs. And the telegraph had 15,000 miles of telegraph cables just for military purposes. Yeah. When should I do the people?
Do that.
Oh, okay. So many spies traveled in hot air balloons, and a Civil War spy, Thada Lowe, traveled 1,000 feet in a hot air balloon.
Yeah, so there is more Civil War women spies than you might think. One of them was Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who was a Confederate spy in Washington, who spied at the White House. Using cipher disks, she wrote a message and smuggled it to General Beauregard. This was important information, which helped them win the Battle of Manassas. Rose ended up getting jailed twice for getting caught spying, but she kept on finding ways. To get messages to General Beauregard, and she never stopped trying to spy.
Okay, so another female spy was Belle Boyd, and so Belle Boyd is right here. She said, "My memories were written, and a portion of them already in the hands of publishers. When the starting news came, which has thrilled all Europe and filled her inhabitants with horror. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln presents a President of the United States." So Belle Boyd was a major spy for the Confederacy, and she had many spy rings to find information on the Union.
Elizabeth Van Lew was also another great spy. She was part of the Union, and she had great social standings with a lot of men in the Confederate Army. So because of this, her social standings, it made her spying much easier, so she could get information out of them way faster. She had great social standings with a man who owned a prison, and this was where a lot of important Union spies were being kept. So she was able to smuggle them out with the help of some maids, and she hid them in her mansion until they could escape back to the north.
There was another spy for the Union named John Scobell, and he was a spy that spied as a slave. So he was acting as if he was a slave, and he was telling the Union how he was treated as a slave. And Alan Pinkerton, which you'll find more about later, called him cool-headed, and he was one of Alan Pinkerton's workers.
So Alan Pinkerton was the head of the Union Spy Intelligence Agency. Before the war, he started his own private investigation corporation, and then during the war he joined forces with the government. So they had a total of 24 spies that were the best spies in the USA at the time. He trained them. He was also known as Major E.J. Allen, and he he almost single-handedly caught Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who was spying in Washington.
Another spy was Harriet Tubman, and she was a former slave who helped many other slaves escape with the Underground Railroad, and she helped about 700 people. And then later, after she helped those 700 people, she helped the Union figure out information on ship sizes for the Confederates.
Yes. Okay, so there was also a group of spy people. It's not a specific person. It's called Black Dispatch, and these were black spies in the Civil War. They were not their own intelligence group. They were just called that because they were either former slaves or just wanted to be spies. It was a lot easier for them to be spies because a lot of the officers didn't know they could talk as well and they could comprehend as well as any other human. So they had it really easy when it came to spying. There was actually two Black Dispatch in the Confederate White House and who spied on Jefferson Davis. They were also, but when they did get caught, they had much more severe punishments because they were black.
Okay, so many of the Confederate spies spied in Washington, D.C., and they went to Washington, D.C. to gather information on if there are any documents going to be published. And Robert E. Lee called his Confederate spies the eyes of his army, and when his eyes of the army would go to Washington, D.C., they'd basically have shifts so they could take off time to spy, so they could have like a break for like sleep and stuff like that.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to methods of codes. So one major method of coding was wigwagging, which was commonly used on both sides. Many were familiar with the code before the war, so it made it really easy to decipher and figure out what messages were being brought back and forth. It was basically flags, and then you just wave them, and then however many waves would equal a letter, and then the letters on the outside would match up with letters on the inside on a cipher disc. And both sides would wag, so a lot of the discs that were found and a lot of the flags that were wagged were, a lot of them were intercepted and found out. In a campaign in Charleston, there were about 76 Confederate signalists looking for possible Union codes to be found and to try and decipher if there was any rebel.
Okay, so right next to Elle, there's coding quilts. So there's different patterns on the quilt that shows different codes, and so these would get passed on to many people. Normally Harriet Tubman was also a major person who used these, so she'd pass these on to the people she was bringing to the north, and it would basically tell them if there were any enemies nearby.
Yes, and then there was another one that was used. It was a chart of letters like this one, and then the second letter in the code would be the beginning word, and then the rest would be in the second line. That was also used. And invisible ink was very common. A lot of them were made out of lemon juice, and then you would put them in a hot surface so you would see the message. But others were homemade, and Elizabeth Van Loo had one. If you soak it in milk, then you would only be able to see it that way.
Okay, so another method for codes is the clothesline code. So if there were no clothes on the clothesline, that would mean that there wasn't any enemies nearby or trying to do anything. But if there was clothes on the clothesline, it would mean that there's enemies nearby, and yeah, it basically mean if they were planning to attack.
Yes, and so many of the spies who were in the Civil War, they usually got paid about $2 per mission. But if they got to a point where they were doing secret missions that were really hard or they're really top secret, they would get paid as much as $15 per mission. when they did get caught, a lot of them were treated differently. Women weren't usually punished because they were women, and the women weren't. It wasn't as thought that they would be spies, so they wouldn't get punished as much. Men had it worse, and so did black people. When they get caught, they either got hanged or they were sent to a political prison.
So more about women. So women normally would spy or steal weaponry through their hoop skirts. So they'd put like weaponry, supplies, or anything in their hoop skirts so that they could give it to either the Union or Confederacy.
So after the Civil War, a lot of the image of women changed. Many women were seen to be able to do more and not just housewives. The Civil War kind of helps refuel women's rights, and it helped us today to have more rights than we did before.
Yeah. So nowadays for spies, there's more spying through computers because there's internet for today, I guess. And so that's a way that they'd spy. And some spies today spy through countries instead of their own. So
Yeah, and then spies, they have changed a lot, but during like the World War I, after the Civil War, they still used some of the methods of cipher and code that was used during the Civil War. Although it's a lot of change to online spying and online privacy access, a lot of the spy methods used in the Civil War were later used.
that's it.